Good afternoon. My name is Barry Bishop, President of Virginians for High Speed Rail. We have over 400 people registered for today's town hall to learn more about a net zero Amtrak for a sustainable future. The purpose of our virtual town hall series is to give Virginians an opportunity to hear from and engage with the leading transportation decision makers and thinkers in the Commonwealth and nation today. Our town hall series is made possible at no cost to participants through the generous support of our program sponsor, WSP, and our supporting sponsors, Washington, D.C. South Carmel Church Station and Plugger and Associates. We thank them for their support. One bit of housekeeping, please send your questions via the chat box to our Executive Director, Danny Plugger, who will address them to our speakers today. Today's town hall will also be posted on YouTube sometime next week, and we encourage you to share the link to it with your colleagues. For those of you not familiar with Virginians for High Speed Rail, we were founded in the 1990s by business leaders in Richmond and Hampton Roads to advocate for expansion of passenger rail in the Commonwealth and to build a grassroots support for the Southeast High-Speed Rail Corridor connecting Washington, D.C. to Virginia, North Carolina, and Point South. A couple of quick facts that are relevant to this afternoon's town hall. Since VHSR was founded, Virginia's Amtrak trains have removed 12.5 billion passenger miles from our roads, or about 40,000 vehicles worth of traffic, reducing our fuel consumption by over 160 million gallons and preventing the release of nearly 1.5 million metric tons of CO2 pollution. Transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the Commonwealth, and while our passenger trains are by far more environmentally friendly than regular automobiles, we can always do more. Virginia's regional trains broke their annual ridership record this fiscal year, reaching nearly 1.3 million trips. Virginians are certainly doing their part by taking the train more often. Our speakers this afternoon will address how Amtrak can do even more to reduce CO2 pollution. Kara Oldhouser is the Director of Sustainability at Amtrak. With a start in interior design, her 15 plus years of professional experience in sustainability positioned her to tackle Amtrak's diverse opportunities of adapting a centuries-old mode of transportation toward a resilient new era of rail. Kara collaborates on cross-departmental teams to advance the company's net zero goals and integrate climate considerations into design standards, policies, strategic planning, and project prioritization. Laura Fotiou is the Sustainability and Climate Resilience Manager at Amtrak. In this role, Laura leads the implementation of Amtrak's net zero strategy. She began her career at Amtrak 10 years ago in the Environmental Health and Safety Group, where she established and incorporated new environmental policies and procedures across operations. In 2017, Progressive Railroading named her one of rail transportation's rising stars, and in 2022, her environmental expertise brought her to Amtrak's Strategy and Planning Department to integrate sustainability considerations and emissions reductions into long-range planning and corporate strategy. Please welcome Kara and Laura.
Thank you, Barry. Very warm welcome. Excellent. All right, I have a couple of slides that I think will help with giving you an idea of what Amtrak is working on. So if you would bear with me, give me one moment. All right. Start video. Here we go. All right, so Laura took you through the overall agenda of the topics that we'd like to cover. As you've probably heard many times, Amtrak is our national intercity passenger railroad. Our goal is to bring more train service to more people and more places. And Barry had in his opening remarks just the importance of being able to have that connectivity and the environmental benefits that it brings. So being able to get more people out of planes and out of their cars into our trains is one of the most sustainable approaches that we can take. You can find more information about our sustainability program on Amtrak.com. We released our FY22 sustainability report several months ago, so that has highlights from the work that we've accomplished across departments, from employee spotlights to other highlights of programmatic advances. It has our sustainability progress against our corporate goals, which we set on an annual basis. It also has insights into what we're trying to advance and different categories that might not get as much news or attention, but then there are things that you may see in the news which look something like this. So if you go to Amtrak.com, we've had this great little plug in here from our marketing department. Underneath where this orange arrow is, we have the travel green icon. And our marketing team thought, you know, we should just put this up there to see what kind of interest we get from our visitors to Amtrak.com. It links directly to our sustainability page, which is directly below the orange arrow. So that is where you can see and read the latest of our advances within our sustainability program. What we saw from that little icon, which is a great signal of the interest of this topic to our customers, was a 2,000% increase in traffic to our sustainability domain page on Amtrak.com. But more immediately, you will see all of the news that we have from the developments across the country. So our Cascade service in the upper right-hand corner for the first EV bus on our state-supported routes up in the state of Washington that connects our customers between Seattle and Bellingham. I had the pleasure of riding that, and it was great to see our customers' reactions to learning that this was a step that the company is taking, that we have state-level partners that are helping to fund and have the infrastructure in place to make this transition happen. Earlier today, in the lower right-hand corner, building on the IIJA, there was a new tranche of funding that was announced. So it's really exciting to see the committed level of investment in intercity passenger rail and the importance that that has for us being able to advance our infrastructure projects. Anyone with questions about renewable diesel? Laura is the woman to talk to. She helped to spearhead this initiative, which is a great transition away from conventional diesel in the state of California. It is the first place where we are launching this and have fueling stations around the state in order to be able to comply with their emissions regulations. Moving on to things that are specifically internal to Amtrak. Not this past July, but the July before, we took a commitment proposal to our board of directors. And at that time, the strategy and planning team had just taken on the sustainability group. So it is kind of, again, a signal that the company has made where these decisions are at the front end of where large projects and strategic initiatives that really shape the direction of the company, looking back the first 50 years of what Amtrak looked like and the type of service that it delivered, but looking forward to what the next 50 plus years will deliver to the United States and the customers that ride Amtrak. And so we, as our responsibility to help shepherd Amtrak towards a more sustainable, more resilient future, came to the board of directors with this climate commitment. And we asked for their support and their backing to help us galvanize our workforce and have this guiding set of 5 key actions that will help us remain focused on really key initiatives that will more directly integrate climate resilience into the way that we do business, into the way that we have processes that are set up, whether it's policies or design standards, which you'll hear about later, but then also in our mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions to allow us to set a really ambitious goal and target of net zero by 2045, which you'll hear about in a moment, and everything else that has to fit into a program of that size that so directly affects every aspect and corner of Amtrak. I'm proud to say that we received unanimous approval from our board of directors, which to me was a great reinforcement that there is commitment in our leadership, beginning from the board of directors through our CEO and our executives. They have been amazing advocates and have been partners in us bringing ideas and direction to the company. And I really look forward to see where we get to take this. The first part of this, Laura's going to take us through the mitigation and net zero components of the 5, and then later on we'll go into the climate resilience aspect. So Laura, I will hand it off to you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Kara. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to start with talking about kind of our baseline from the strategy and taking a look at our emissions footprint prior to actually building the strategy itself. So on your screen, you'll see a different kind of pie chart, really taking a look at what our emission sources are as a company. Historically, we've only focused on the greenhouse gas emissions that come from our owned or operated equipment. But in the net zero target, we are committed to evaluating the entire footprint. So you'll see on the screen from left to right is our emissions varying from our direct control to indirect control, otherwise called scope 1, 2, and scope 3. So on the left is our direct emissions and the portion that our direct emissions from owned and operated equipment emit into the environment. So what are we directly combusting and emitting greenhouse gases? In the middle, you'll see the portion of our footprint that is associated to our indirect emissions coming from our owned and operated equipment. So what this means is the electricity that we purchase or the steam that we purchase, someone upstream is generating emissions for that production of electricity or steam. And that's what's referred to as our scope 2. And then on the right is our upstream and downstream emissions. So as I mentioned, this is kind of new to our vision and our focus. We took an initial look at our supply chain to understand where our biggest, our hotspots are in our what's called scope 3. And so you'll see there, we've got diesel production. So upstream for our use of diesel, someone's got to, extract that diesel, refine it, transport it to us. So that upstream production is an area of emissions for us in our upstream. And then you'll see the other categories are listed there. The takeaway from this slide is really to understand that first, our most critical assets for achieving this goal is going to be our rail operations and ensuring that we're transitioning our rail operations over to zero emission sources. But it's also that's not our only source we're looking at. We can't be a sustainable business without looking at our whole picture and considering the entire impact of our emissions. So following this perspective of looking at our entire footprint, not just our direct equipment, but also our value chain, this carries into our vision. If Kara, you want to go to the next slide. Our vision will, you'll see a visual statement. I'm not sure, Kara, if you pressed, there we go, I see it now. This is our vision statement. So continuing that perspective of we can't just focus on our own equipment, we have to go across the entire value chain. So by 2045, we see Amtrak as a net zero mobility provider across the entire value chain. And visually, you'll see on the left, we have our vehicles, and then in the middle, the infrastructure, and to the right, our value chain and business operations. So we are ambitious with this target. We are hoping to bring along our suppliers and our partners to achieve it across everything that we do. Aligning to this vision, this is kind of our starting block of how we built the strategy is we looked at our footprint, we assessed how big all the sources are in our footprint and how do we address everything. So you'll see underneath the vision, there are 12 building blocks. These 12 building blocks are designed to address every source of our emissions. Generally speaking, the pathway to decarbonization, we're focused on driving energy efficiency first and foremost. So any of the energy that we do use, we need to make sure that we're using it as efficiently as possible and we're reducing waste there. Then looking at those energy sources, we need to make sure that we're decarbonizing where those energy sources are coming from. So if it's electricity, we need to make sure that the source of electricity is coming from carbon-free sources. And then lastly, as I mentioned, it's critical that we work together with our partners and with our manufacturers and supply chain to make sure that we're all on board with this vision and we're all working to the same target in order for us to achieve this goal. The few things I'll focus specifically today, as you can see, we have 12 building blocks. I'll focus on what's most critical for us to achieving that goal. So you'll notice around the red dotted lines, we'll talk about our alternative powertrains and the plans we have there. Then we'll also talk about in the near term, what is it we can do? Because we know that the development of alternative powertrains is going to take a while, but in the meantime, what is it that we can be doing to drive down our emissions? And specifically what I'm talking about here is renewable diesel. And then lastly, we'll also talk about the carbon-free power purchasing. So wherever we're electrifying and moving over to zero emissions at the source, we need to make sure wherever that energy is coming from, it is also coming from a carbon-free source. Thank you, Kara. So moving on, we are lucky today that a portion of our business is already deploying a zero emission technology. So our Northeast corridor is electrified, meaning at the point of source, there are no emissions. So as we pass through our dense urban areas on the Northeast corridor, we are directly eliminating any emissions from the cars or planes we replace when our riders choose Amtrak. The great thing about this electrification and the Northeast corridor is now we're focused on the sources of that electricity. We have a goal to achieve 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030, which would then bring the service to a net zero service. So you'll see on the left is an image of our Acela service. About 60% of the actual traction power that we use to power the Northeast corridor is coming from carbon-free sources today. As a whole, our electricity demand, so not just looking at our electric trains, but also our buildings and other sources that are powered with electricity, we are covering that with about 50% of our carbon-free, with 50% carbon-free sources. So we're halfway there towards our goal. We are looking into different technologies or purchasing instruments that we could take on to achieve 100% of that electricity to get there by 2030. All right, and then the bigger challenge we have is our diesel operations. So on your screen is a high-level roadmap of really how we plan to get to net zero by 2045 with our revenue locomotive fleet. On the left, you'll see we have our legacy fleet, which is the internal combustion engines with diesel. Their criteria air pollutants, their emissions standards, really, they meet tier 0. So this decade, as you may know, we are replacing our legacy fleet with the Siemens Charger locomotives. These Charger locomotives meet tier 4 standards. So this means we are significantly reducing our criteria air pollutants and localized pollution compared to our legacy fleet. These Charger engines are actually approved to use renewable diesel, which means we can continue reducing our emissions from a life cycles perspective if we switch over to renewable diesel. They're also 10% fuel efficient, which means, you know, the more fuel efficient we can be, the less energy we're demanding or the less fuel we're using. That's a direct reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions. So during this next decade, as we replace our legacy fleet with these improved Charger locomotives, in parallel, we'll need to develop what the alternative propulsion technology will be that fits our demanding use cases of the diesel locomotives. So you'll see in the future, we've got our prospects of hydrogen, battery, and overhead catenary systems as potential technology solutions to replace diesel operations in the future. So this decade is really critical to working with the industry and our partners to figuring out what that technology solution will be or what mix of technology solutions will be in order to take us to the future. And we'll go to the next slide to talk just a little bit about our interim step in our net zero strategy. So in the interim, where we can and where it's feasible, we will be using renewable diesel in our Charger locomotives to reduce emissions. So what does this mean? Because if it's a renewable diesel, I still look at a locomotive and I'm still seeing emissions out of the locomotive. So what's the benefit of renewable diesel? Renewable diesel is chemically equivalent to conventional, petroleum-based diesel, but it is taken from agricultural waste. So the process of refinement there, we're taking a product of a raw material that has already absorbed CO2 from the atmosphere, and that CO2 that's built into that carbon that's built into the diesel is not affecting the carbon budget. So we're gonna, reuse essentially the carbon that went into the atmosphere. It's absorbed by plants. It's being refined into renewable diesel and then emitted again. So it's a bit of a cycle going on there. In general, from the renewable diesel that's available today, it's about a 60% reduction in our life cycle emissions. That's because, of course, there's still a refinement process involved. We still need to transport the fuel, and this is new carbon that's being added to the carbon budget. But the benefit, again, it is renewable diesel is a drop in fuel, which means we don't need to change any of our equipment or the infrastructure. It is chemically equivalent to fossil diesel, and so it can be a direct replacement of fossil diesel where it's available. So the challenge today for us is getting a supply. It's readily available in California. So as Kara mentioned, we are using it with our state partners today in California in the state services. Next step is how do we, bring the supply across the country and make it available to other fueling locations for us. The next slide. So that's our interim step. It is not a solution. It's not a final net zero emission solution. We really need to look at what technologies are available to us or what needs to be developed in order to replace our diesel locomotives. So on your screen, you'll see an initial assessment. As an industry as a whole, we have a common understanding of what technologies are available today. This is applied to Amtrak's use cases. So in all the multicolors in front of you are the different locomotive types or use cases that we have. Our MOW, so maintenance of way, our switchers in the yards that are used to put together the consist, and then the different ranges of distances our revenue locomotives go. We are already using the overhead contact system today on the Northeast Corridor. This is a known zero emission solution. We have the benefit of running on the Northeast Corridor. We'll take a look at where else we can electrify additional routes, or I don't know, whether it's additional routes or islands of catenary, and being creative to use this technology with maybe another power source like batteries to replace what's currently being run by diesel engines. Other technologies that we see as viable solutions today are hydrogen fuel cells and batteries. As you'll see, again, the challenge we have here is energy density. So where technology is today, nothing is meeting the energy density of diesel. So we may need to be creative, especially as it comes to long distance routes. We'll need to find either a tender car or we would need to fuel more frequently if we're going to these alternative power sources. The other option, again, as I mentioned, is maybe a combination of both. So whether it's battery locomotive and hydrogen fuel cells or overhead contact system as we're going into a station. We are open to all options, and we'll be evaluating how we can deploy these technologies to fit our different use cases. So today I just covered briefly our main levers really to decarbonize Amtrak. What we can be doing in the near term, which is sourcing that carbon-free electricity for our electrified routes and for our buildings and other electrified sources, and then transitioning over to renewable diesel in our diesel locomotives as we, in parallel, determine what that alternative propulsion technology is going to be that we'll use in the next decade to take us to net zero by 2045. I will note on the next slide, so this is a visual of how our emissions will change over time with those main decarbonization levers. It's a bit of an oversimplification because there are a lot of challenges ahead of us, and we do really need our partners to work together and really to achieve this challenging time ahead of us. But I'm very excited. We've seen the national blueprint that the DOT has put out. The DOE is working heavily in batteries and hydrogen. There's a lot of momentum across the country really focused on decarbonization measures in these heavy industries to get us to net zero as a country by 2050, and we think we can do it by 2045 as a company. On the next slide, I'll just note, Kara mentioned this, the two actions you may have seen out in the news. On the left-hand side, this is a Pacific Surfliner train. Our partners with the Capital Corridor, San Joaquin and LoSan, our Pacific Surfliner, we're using renewable diesel to run those services today. This started in, I would say this summer, and we've been continuing on with that operation with using renewable diesel. And on the right, as Kara mentioned, our first EV bus. So it's a reminder that we don't only run trains, we do also have our throughway buses to make sure we're connecting our passengers to trains. And our net zero goal is really focused on everything that we do. All of our vehicle types, all of our assets are under this target, and we are working to decarbonize everything that we do as a company. And Kara, I'll pass it over to you to take us on to, net zero is not our only climate action that we're taking. There's more under the climate commitment.
Got it. Thanks, Laura. So as we move from mitigation into resilience, I like to borrow a phrase that one of our colleagues introduced us to, adaptation, to make sure that we're all familiar with the different phrases that are used when you talk about sustainability. Adaptation is the process of getting to a state of resilience, which is a state of being. So adaptation are all of the steps that we are taking daily by upskilling our employees and building resources and tools for them to use so that Amtrak as a whole, as an entity, becomes a more resilient intercity national passenger railroad, and that we have a resilient workforce of 20,000+ employees that know what to do and how to handle things and design options to select that are most appropriate based on what those stressors might be that are presenting themselves today versus what's coming in the future. In the end of 21, starting 2022, we published our first Northeast Corridor Climate Resilience Strategic Plan, which was developed off of a technical assessment and a climate vulnerability assessment of the Northeast Corridor. So we started there because those are the assets that we own. That's the infrastructure that we have the greatest influence over. When we had the 9 priority actions listed within the Climate Resilience Strategic Plan, which I'll have as a quick aside, both documents are publicly available on Amtrak's FOIA page. So anyone in the public can read what's in these documents. We identified 9 priority actions, and those 9 priority actions are intended for us from 2022 to 2025 for us to organize efforts within 3 categories of people, practices, and assets, because we realize that making a more resilient Amtrak is not just hardening our infrastructure. It's not just elevating our signal huts. It's not just addressing areas that have chronic flooding problems or responding more earnestly to heat waves when they come through the Northeast. It is, again, making a broader awareness to our employees through town hall meetings. In a leadership conference that we had 2 weeks ago in Philadelphia, our executives were talking about it from the stage, and it became very apparent that this is something that the company is focused on and we are committed to. So within the technical side of the vulnerability assessment, that was a way for us to be able to visualize the Northeast Corridor differently. We leveraged GIS, which is a geospatial information system. So those are the maps that you see on the cover here. We had those against 4 different climate hazards: heat, wind, storm surge and sea level rise, and heavy precipitation events, because on the Northeast Corridor, we see our 2 most critical climate threats as heat or high temperatures and water of different ways that it's making its way to our infrastructure. And so now those GIS maps that were custom built for Amtrak show our employees that leverage those maps what it looks like today, wherever the rail locations are, wherever our stations are located, and then what it looks like in 2050 and 2100. And those are based on 2 different projections of how intense climate change may become based on what emissions projections we have globally. Several other outcomes from this work, because like Laura showed you, there are certain levers that we need to pull more immediately. Some have a faster return on investment, like the renewable diesel. That is an immediate 63% emissions reduction off the top when we put it into use. Similarly, there are actions that we need to take today that really help to set us up for making a faster transition when it comes to designing and building our infrastructure. And with the IIJA delivering $22 billion in funds, we have an enormous amount of construction in front of us, and we have a great opportunity to be able to leverage that and prepare for a different future and to protect our assets differently. So on the left-hand side, you'll see design standards and an internal technical specifications review. This was a focused effort that we looked at the ARIMA standards, which is something that our engineers reference for technical specifications. There are external examples, like the Climate Resiliency Design Guidelines from New York City. And then there are other entities that have created best practices or resources for us to be able to leverage. The intention for this was to look at both internal and external documents. Our teams across the company that are responsible for assets that range from our customer-facing stations, so the areas that you see and ride in and out of, to the offices where our employees work, the maintenance yards where we repair and maintain and get our trains ready for service, as well as the rail infrastructure that you ride on as a customer. We all reference different documents, and those documents historically look back at what historic record has shown and reference that in a view that is not going to be particularly helpful as we prepare for investments that last 20, 30, 50 years. Some of our tunnels and bridges are 75, 150 years old. And so we need to think about what is coming and what those conditions might be that we need to withstand. So that's why we were looking at documents internally for climate readiness, and also to see where they are aligned or not to our net zero carbon emissions goal of 2045. If we're referencing natural gas as a preferred energy, we need to address that and change it so that we have a very clear alignment, so that when it comes time to procure backup generators or other things that are using fossil fuels, that our teams know that they are empowered and the company has set a corporate commitment that backs them up when it comes time for them to be sourcing something different that has a direct alignment to net zero by 2045. On the right-hand side, you see two other screenshots. You're not expected to read these, so there will not be a test at the end. So we have the design guidebook that is up top, and then a climate business case calculator that is below. The design guidebook was a result of climate employee roundtables. We pulled folks together from engineering, from procurement, finance, and what we heard from them is what's happening in the field, where they see gaps or opportunities in the processes that we have as a business and a company. And so the design guidebook is to be a tool that our practitioners that are building the facilities for our new aero fleet, for folks who are responsible for our substations and track design, that they have examples from around the world of how other rail entities have addressed these same climate hazards of flooding, high heat, other things that are stressing our system that others are experiencing elsewhere, and giving them examples and guidance to best practices and things to consider when we go out for final design and construction. The climate business case calculator is something that is currently in pilot. It is still in development, and we are trying to work it out to make sure that it is most appropriate for our business and what is helpful. We all know that money speaks, and that having a return on investment is something that we all understand personally and professionally. And so when it comes time to build a business case, right now, there are so many entities that don't know how to value the cost of doing nothing against the cost of climate resilience. So if we look at a substation that might be located next to a river, we could look at that cost of how long that asset is going to last. We can look at what it might cost to build a flood wall, or to have a pump system, or to deploy our forces if there's a heavy precipitation event or if we start to see riverine flooding. This tool is designed to help us leverage climate models that will give us an estimation to be able to get a range of what the dollar value might be if we do nothing versus if we install that flood wall, how long is it going to take for us to pay that back in avoided damage with the number of floods that would continue to happen at that location based on the projections from the climate models. So you can understand why it's still in development and it's not finalized yet, but we really are focused on finding tools and ways to break this down so that it is an easy, obvious decision of what is most appropriate for the projects that we're taking on. This is a view of our potential future national network. This is a screenshot from the Amtrak Connects Us vision document, which is now moving into the federal corridor ID program with applications, I believe, being announced shortly. That's another team's responsibility, so I won't step on their toes and try to cover their topic for them. But this is to give you an idea. When we look at the news and we hear about mudslides and coastal erosion in California, when we hear about mudslides along the Hudson River, when we read about flooding and sea level rise in Norfolk, Virginia, or the Chesapeake, and all of these different climate stressors that are showing up more frequently and more intensely across the national network, we have our hands full of operating a national railroad in the conditions today. But what we're focused on for this coming year is conducting a national climate vulnerability assessment. What I mentioned earlier was the Northeast Corridor version. This will look at every coast and every corner of the United States and all of the routes in which we operate. We will be digging into data that we have available and looking at how we can identify the hotspots that are in our network and what may be accelerating in its changes and intensity and frequency over time, and to start to look into the operations that we have and what may need to be adjusted or adapted so that we become more resilient. I'm really excited about that work and everything that Laura shared with you. It is a very dynamic space at Amtrak. There is so much going on outside of the company that's really helping this effort as a whole be not something where we feel isolated or that we're doing this on our own, but there's a great network of other rail operators and infrastructure owners that are willing to come to the table and talk about the challenges that they're facing as well. So I really appreciate your time and your attention today and your interest in this topic. And I think with that, we are available for any questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Kara. The first question is, there was a lot of focus on kind of improving our train sets, preparing Amtrak for new technologies that are coming down the pike, preparing for resiliency. And one of the things I think that gets kind of left out is, what role do improvements at our stations play in making Amtrak more sustainable? It seems like a lot of the low-hanging fruit, at least here in Virginia, solar panels on our stations. I know our Staples Mill, which is the largest station by passenger volume in the South, has a huge parking lot, which we expanded. Huge opportunity to kind of put a little mini solar farm over there. And I think that would help mitigate Roll's contribution to greenhouse gas and climate challenges.
Mm-hmm. Laura, do you want to take the first end of that and then I can add on?
Yeah, so Danny, good question. We are, so as I mentioned, we have our net zero strategy this year. We've deployed the program to actually implement it. And one of the focuses in our vision and in that strategy is our carbon-free purchasing and deployment of production of that. So we are looking into solar on roofs, solar on site, and how can we maximize our real estate to do that. But also we need to, again, partner with our owners because there are many stations and properties that we don't directly own. So it will require coordination and willingness with our partners as well to do that.
Yeah. And I would say from what I was speaking about at the end, energy efficiency is really important as a whole across our range of portfolio, different types of buildings and assets. Even from a climate perspective, looking at how we design those stations so that they are using less water, keeping our employees and our customers protected from the heat and humidity that you might be experiencing in places like the state of Virginia. That combined with a net zero view is how we're trying to make sure that it's always a dual approach and discussion. So we have great stations employees that are asking questions about how we can leverage third-party rating systems or look at ways of improving the efficiencies of our stations. But yeah, we're always open to ideas and suggestions. So thank you for the good question.
Absolutely, and we're certainly ready. I know Virginia, in partnership with Amtrak, is buying a lot of our stations, so we would like to obviously see those happen and be willing participant to be a test bed. If y'all looking for a state to run things through. A follow-up from our attendees. How much of an issue is the state of the current and future kind of electricity transmission grid system, and what can Amtrak do to help resolve those issues? Essentially, this question is kind of around, we hear a lot in the news about the grid having a lot of strain when it comes to electricity generation or transmission, and how can Amtrak help with that, and is that being taken into a consideration with the sustainability and net zero visions?
That is a great question. From my knowledge, we don't have any direct projects underway or directives to figure that out, but it sounds like it could be a really great opportunity. And it's certainly something that I will take back and discuss internally to figure out if someone is leading that and what we might be able to leverage with our existing traction network.
And then,
Danny, if I could add, while solar panels on our property, compared to the electricity we could produce compared to how much we have on the Northeast Corridor is somewhat minimal, I think that's one action that we can certainly take and are striving to take in order to reduce our demand on the grid. I think that's a really good question, whoever submitted that. Thank you.
And here's one more follow-up. Can you speak more to what is renewable diesel and how it differs from traditional diesel, and are the carbon emissions from locomotives any lower?
Yeah, I can speak to that. So the raw material that's used to produce the diesel is different. That's how it differs from petroleum-based conventional diesel, which is obviously coming from petroleum and requires extraction, refinement from petroleum to conventional diesel versus renewable diesel. There's all sorts of different sources. I actually recommend, if you're not familiar with it, CARB, the California Air Resource Board, requires providers to certify their renewable diesel. So there is a whole list of where the renewable diesel, what the product is produced from and where it's coming from. So they calculate in this certification what their carbon intensity is of the renewable diesel. So you can really understand how much of a difference it makes, how far you're transporting the product, and then what the product is made from, what impact that has on the carbon intensity. So at the point of use in a locomotive, there's still the same emissions coming from it, carbon emissions coming from it. The value, though, of the use of renewable diesel is that in the whole life cycle use, so from production to use, it's reducing generally 60% of our life cycle emissions. So the fact that the raw materials are using waste products, agricultural products that have absorbed the carbon from the atmosphere and we're re-emitting it, it's this cycle of not introducing any new carbon to the atmosphere.
Thank you. Another question is Amtrak looking at hydrogen fuel cell technology as a possible power source for future locomotives?
Yep, So you saw in our matrix of potential, viable solutions, hydrogen fuel cells is one of those options that we're looking into.
Okay. And so I'm going through all the different questions. As Amtrak evaluates, is Amtrak evaluating battery locomotives for mainline operations, very similar to what you do with freight yards? And is there an opportunity to use this type of engine on any Amtrak route that may not be the Northeast?
Yeah, so similar to the last question, it is one of the technologies we're evaluating, and you saw in that matrix of use cases, using it as a standalone locomotive is likely more applicable to shorter routes, just based on the energy density that it would carry. I'll also refer to, if anyone's interested in seeing the earlier presentation in this series that our Chief Mechanical Officer made, George Hull, earlier in the year. Our aero sets, so the new train sets we're getting, will deploy a battery auxiliary power vehicle in one of the configurations we have. So not specifically a battery locomotive, but it will provide energy to the locomotive in the front through a battery. So that'll be the first deployment really of that technology for us. And I believe you asked, is there a use for it that's not just in our yards? The answer for that is also yes. So we will be exploring battery as a solution as well.
And this was an interesting question. It may be outside of y'all's wheelhouses. But one of the ways to decrease worldwide emissions is to increase accessibility to rail. What are some opportunities to kind of increase accessibility to Amtrak via reducing price, making it a little bit easier as part of the net zero plan?
I can take that one. Our aim is to get more people to more places. So the 500 stations that we serve today, what you saw on the opening slide, that we are looking at another 100 plus communities to serve, to make those connections easier and to get more people off of planes and out of cars onto rail. I totally hear the economic side of that and the pricing. That is the specialty of totally different departments than sustainability. So I would not be the right person to answer for them. It is important for us to make sure that Amtrak is accessible to customers of varying socioeconomic access to funds to be able to ride Amtrak. But this is a question that I will gladly take back to our revenue department, knowing that it came from a public presentation and there are questions about this. I think these are important things to hear from you and your community and your members and listeners for us to have that in consideration as we move forward.
Thank you. And I think the new, hopefully, pricing model will help with that a little bit and make it a little bit more accessible. And I know I took a train from Richmond to Hampton Roads here in the Commonwealth, and it was $20 round trip, way better than driving or doing mileage. We have a question from the audience that was, is there anything that we can do about the sustainability of onboard services? Essentially, they said that every item that they got kind of came in wasteful packaging. And does that fit into the sustainability plans as well as making items that are purchased and consumed on board recyclable and a little bit more environmentally friendly?
Great question. We know that this is something that's highly visible to our customers. We hear it often. You are not alone. Our food and beverage team is constantly looking for solutions in packaging. With the pricing and the investment that we have from Congress, we do our absolute best to try to find solutions that can deliver a food and beverage experience to our customers within the budgets that we have. And so I think there are solutions that they're rolling out right now. I did receive an email recently that we're going to compostable cutlery and utensils on board some of our routes. I know that we also source locally on some of our routes. So if you look at the menu, you'll be able to see where we are sourcing from local vineyards or local breweries or other local suppliers. And that is something that we're really proud of. I get it and I hear it, and it's not something that our food and beverage team is sleeping on. They are actively working on this. The packaging space is a tough one, and it's certainly something that we'll take back to them, but I do know that they are working on this. So stay tuned for developments as they continue to be rolled out.
Thank you both. And do y'all want to offer any last thoughts or comments and before I wrap this up?
Ride more trains.
Thank you again, Kara and Laura, for your presentation today. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who participated today. Just a couple quick announcements. November 27th, so in a couple weeks, we're doing the first ever State of Rail 2023, featuring our Executive Director of the Virginia Passenger Rail Authority, Jen DeBrule, our Director of Rail and Public Transportation, as well as Rich Dalton, the CEO of Virginia Railway Express. I hope you all will join us for that program. I think it's going to be very exciting. Also, be on the lookout in the next couple weeks. We'll be releasing our next passenger rail report, 16 pages of incredible information and vision, co-written with the Southern Environmental Law Center, New River Valley Passenger Rail, Greater Washington Partnership, and RVA 757 Connects. We're very much looking forward to releasing this report, and it will be in your email boxes in the next couple weeks. And on the cover, you'll see the Siemens dual mode engines that will operate in the Commonwealth of Virginia and allow us, hopefully, future opportunities to continue to decarbonize our rail system. And so thank you all again for participating, and I look forward to seeing everybody later this month on November 27th for our next program. Have a great day.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you.